The wind that tore through Blackwood Ridge did not just carry the cold, it carried the grit of the mines, a fine, metallic dust that settled in the creases of clothes and the lines of faces. It was November in the high country of Colorado. The year 1878. The sky was a bruised purple, sitting heavy on the jagged peaks that fenced the town in like prison walls. Down in the mud of the main thoroughfare, the air smelled of wet pine, coal smoke, and the stale, copper tang of spilled whiskey. Clara Whitfield stood on the rough-hewn platform outside the assay office, her hands clasped so tightly before her that her knuckles were white as bone. She was 22 years old, though the last month had aged her spirit by a decade. She wore her best dress, a dark blue calico that had once been vibrant but was now frayed at the hem, shielded by a gray wool shawl that offered little defense against the biting wind. She fixed her eyes on the horizon, just above the heads of the men gathering in the street. She would not look at them. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her eyes dart or her chin tremble. Her father, Elias Whitfield, had been buried only 2 weeks, and before the dirt had even settled on his grave, the vultures had descended. Sheriff Brady stood to her left, a man whose belly strained against the buttons of his vest, his thumbs hooked casually into his gun belt. To her right was Banker Thorne, a thin, skeletal man who held a ledger as if it were a Bible. "Gentlemen, step close," the sheriff bellowed, his voice booming over the murmur of the crowd. "We are here to settle the estate of the late Elias Whitfield. As many of you know, the deceased left behind significant obligations, outstanding loans, unpaid taxes, and feed bills." He paused, letting the words sink in. The crowd was a mixture of miners, trappers, and drifters, men with hard eyes and lonely hearts. They did not care about debts. They cared about the woman standing in the wind. "The law requires these debts be satisfied," the sheriff continued, gesturing toward Clara with a hand that looked like a paw. "Miss Whitfield here has no coin to pay. Therefore, under the county statutes regarding indigent labor and debt recovery, her contract of employment is up for auction. The highest bidder secures her domestic services until said debt is paid in full." It was a lie wrapped in the silk of legal language. Clara knew it. The debts were inflated, numbers scribbled in Thorne's ledger with ink that was barely dry. This was not about money. This was about a town with too many men and too few women, and a system designed to grind the weak into dust. It was a sale. They could call it a labor contract, but every man in the mud below knew they were bidding on a wife, a servant, or worse. Clara felt a fresh wave of nausea, but she swallowed it down. She had made herself a promise in the dark of her empty house the night before. She would not beg, she would not scream. If she was to be sold like a broodmare, she would stand like a statue. $10 per month on the contract," a voice shouted from the back. Sheriff Brady laughed. $10? We are looking for a lump sum to clear the ledger. Boys, bidding starts at $100 for the full term. Do I hear 100? 100! Shouted a man near the front, a grubby prospector with tobacco stains in his beard. 110, called another. The numbers began to climb. Clara felt the eyes on her, heavy and physical, like hands touching the fabric of her dress. She focused on a singular pine tree on the ridge line, forcing her mind to go blank. 150. 175. The atmosphere in the street shifted from business to sport. Men were laughing, nudging each other. It was a game to them. The humiliation of a decent woman was afternoon entertainment. Then, a hush fell over the back of the crowd. It started as a ripple of silence and spread forward until the laughter died in the throats of the men at the front. A horse had moved into the circle, a massive roan gelding, breathing clouds of steam into the cold air. The rider was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and wrapped in a coat of heavy wool and worn buckskin. He sat easy in the saddle, but there was nothing relaxed about him. He looked like a piece of the landscape that had torn itself free, hard, silent, and dangerous. It was Silas Crow. Clara had heard the whispers about him. They said he lived alone near the timberline, that he had made a fortune in beaver pelts before the trade died out, and now pulled gold from a claim no one else could find. They said he had killed a man in Abilene with his bare hands. They said he was half bear, half ghost. Silas did not look at the crowd. His eyes, dark and unreadable, were fixed on the sheriff. His face was weathered, marked by the wind and sun, covered in a thick, dark beard that hid his expression. He looked at the platform with a contained disgust that was more terrifying than anger. He saw the rigged game instantly, the way the banker smirked, the lack of proper paperwork, the gleam in the sheriff's eye. 200, the prospector yelled, trying to break the sudden tension. 300, Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried through the street like the crack of a rifle. It was a deep, baritone rumble that vibrated in the chest. The sheriff blinked, his smile faltering. $300 from Mr. Crow. Do I hear $350? The prospector looked at Silas, saw the size of him, and spat in the mud. He shook his head and stepped back. $325. The brothel keeper from the south end of town called out, though his voice wavered. $400, Silas said immediately. The crowd murmured. $400 was a fortune. It was enough to build a house, to buy a small herd. Sheriff Brady narrowed his eyes. He didn't like Silas. Men like Brady hated men they couldn't intimidate. You are eager. Crow, the sheriff sneered. Got a lot of cleaning needs doing up in that shack of yours? Silas did not answer. He simply sat on his horse, his hand resting on the pommel, waiting. The sheriff looked around. 400 going once. The banker, Thorne, leaned over and whispered something to the sheriff. Brady nodded. 400 going twice, Brady said, dragging it out, hoping for one of his cronies to jump in. But the men were cowed. The money was too high, and the man bidding was too hard. Sold, Brady snapped. To Silas Crow for $400. Clara felt her knees buckle, just for a second, before she locked them straight again. It was over. She belonged to the mountain man. She looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for cruelty in his face. He was terrifyingly large. Dismounting his horse with a fluid grace that belied his size, he walked up the steps of the platform, the wood groaning under his boots. He did not look at her. He walked past her to the table where the banker sat. Silas reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He counted out 20 gold double eagles, stacking them with a heavy clink on the table. Sign the release, Silas said. The banker scribbled furiously, blowing on the ink before handing the document to Silas. The sheriff counted the coins, his greed momentarily outweighing his dislike. All legal and proper, the sheriff said, grinning. She is all yours. Crow. Silas took the paper. He turned then, finally facing Clara. Up close, he smelled of pine resin and cold air. He was a head and a half taller than her. He reached out, and Clara flinched, bracing for his grip on her arm. But he didn't grab her. He merely gestured toward the steps. Get your things, he said. Clara picked up her single carpet bag from the corner of the platform. She walked down the steps, the crowd parting for them, silence trailing in their wake. She felt the shame burning her cheeks, a hot brand against the cold wind. Silas led his horse, walking beside her, not touching her. They walked past the saloon, past the livery, until they were at the edge of town where the mud gave way to the frozen ruts of the mountain road. He stopped. He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw his eyes clearly. They were not cruel. They were tired. He reached into his coat again and pulled out another pouch, this one worn and soft. He took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused like leather, but warm, and placed the pouch into it. Then he took the paper the banker had signed, folded it, and placed it on top of the money. Clara stared at the items in her hand. The pouch was heavy. What is this? She asked, her voice cracking. Silas looked back toward the mountains. That is $500. And that paper says the debt is paid. Clara looked up at him, confusion warring with the panic in her chest. I don't understand. You are free. Clara, Silas said. His voice was plain, stripping the moment of any drama. You can take that money and buy a seat on the stagecoach south. You can go to Denver. You can go east. No one owns you. Clara's fingers curled around the money. It was real. It was freedom. It was the only thing she had prayed for. But then she looked at the road leading out of town. The stagecoach didn't run until Friday. She had nowhere to sleep. The wolves in the town, the sheriff, the men who had bid on her, they were still there. If she stayed in town with this money, they would find a way to take it, or take her, before the sun rose. And here was this man. He had just spent a fortune to buy her, only to set her loose. "Why?" she whispered. "Because no one should be sold," he said, as if it were the simplest truth in the world. He adjusted the cinch on his saddle. "I am riding back to my cabin. It is a day-and-a-half ride. It is hard country, but it is safe. If you want to come, you will be fed, and no one will bother you. If you want to go, you go." Clara looked at the money, then back at the town. She saw the sheriff watching them from the porch of the assay office. She saw the malice in his stance. She couldn't trust kindness. Kindness was usually a trap, but the weight of the gold in her hand was a kind of proof she had never seen before. He had given her the power to leave him. "If I go with you," she said, measuring her words, "what do you expect in return?" Silas looked her in the eye, and his expression was solemn. "I expect you to keep up, that is all." Clara took a breath. The air was thin and sharp. The mountains were terrifying, vast and indifferent. But the town was malicious. Distance was safety. "I will come with you," she said. Silas nodded once. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a hand to help her up until she stepped toward the horse. And even then, he waited for her to look at him before he boosted her into the saddle. He swung up behind her, but he sat far back on the cantle, leaving a respectful inch of air between her back and his chest. "Let's ride," he said. They left Blackwood Ridge behind, climbing into the teeth of the wilderness. The road dissolved into a trail that wound through dense stands of lodgepole pine. The wind grew fiercer as they ascended, whipping snow sideways so that it stung Clara's face like needles. The journey was brutal. Clara's body, unaccustomed to riding, began to ache within the hour. By the 4th hour, her legs felt like lead and her back throbbed with every step the horse took. But she bit her lip and said nothing. She focused on the rhythm of the horse's hooves and the broad back of the man behind her. Silas was true to his word. He did not speak unless necessary. He did not lean into her. When the trail narrowed and the drop-off to the river below became dizzying, he would guide the horse with a gentle pressure, his arms bracketing her but never constricting her. "We need to stop for water," he said at a creek crossing, his voice barely audible over the wind. He dismounted first and helped her down. Her legs almost gave way when she hit the ground. Silas caught her elbow to steady her, then immediately released it. "Walk it off," he said. "It gets worse before it gets better." She walked in small circles, stamping feeling back into her frozen toes. He offered her a canteen and a strip of dried venison. She ate quickly, the hunger she had ignored all day suddenly roaring to life. They rode until the light began to fail. The temperature plummeted, and the snow began to fall in earnest. Thick, heavy flakes that obscured the trail. "We can't make the cabin tonight," Silas announced. "There is a line shack 2 miles up. We will hole up there." The line shack was little more than a pile of logs chinked with mud, crouching under the shelter of a granite overhang. It was dark, and smelled of old wood smoke and rodents. Silas kicked the door open and ushered her inside out of the gale. He worked quickly in the dark, his hands sure and practiced. Within minutes, he had a fire crackling in the small stone hearth, feeding it deadfall he had pulled from a dry stack in the corner. The light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The shack was tiny. There was a single bunk built into the wall, covered with pine boughs. "You take the bunk," Silas said. He spread his bedroll on the dirt floor near the door, blocking the exit but also placing himself between her and the cold draft. Clara sat on the edge of the bunk, her shawl wrapped tight around her. The intimacy of the space was suffocating. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she barely knew, a man who had bought her. Every instinct she had honed in the mining camp screamed at her to be afraid. But Silas did not look at her. He took a small pot from his pack, melted snow, and made tea. He handed her a tin cup. "Drink," he said. "It warms the blood." She took it, her fingers brushing his. He pulled back quickly. "Thank you, Mr. Crow," she said. "Silas," he corrected. "Just Silas." They drank in silence. The wind howled outside, a lonely, desolate sound. Clara watched him over the rim of her cup. He was staring into the fire, his face unguarded for the first time. She saw the lines of pain etched around his eyes, the gray in his beard that spoke of years, not age. "Why do you live so far out?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Silas hesitated. Then he looked at the flames. People are complicated. Trees are honest. It was a simple answer, but it carried a weight that silenced her. They slept in their clothes for warmth. Clara lay on the pine boughs, listening to the crackle of the fire and the steady breathing of the man on the floor. She kept one hand on the small knife she kept in her boot, just in case. But Silas never moved toward her. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, she woke to a sound. It was a sharp intake of breath, then a low, strangled moan. She sat up. Silas was thrashing in his bedroll, his head turning side to side. "No," he muttered, his voice thick with sleep and terror. "Not the door. Don't open the door." He sounded like a child. The giant man, who had stared down a room full of wolves, was trembling in his sleep. Clara watched him, her heart hammering. She understood nightmares. She had them too, visions of her father coughing blood, of the sheriff's hand on her shoulder. She realized then that his silence wasn't emptiness. It was a dam holding back a flood. "Silas," she whispered. He woke with a start. Sitting up so fast his hand went to the knife at his belt. He looked around wildly, his chest heaving, until his eyes found hers. For a moment, he looked lost. Then the mask slammed back down. He rubbed his face with his hands. "Sorry," he grunted. "It's all right," she said softly. He didn't say anything else. He got up, stoked the fire, and sat staring into the embers until dawn. The next day, the sun broke through the clouds, brilliant and blinding on the snow. They rode for another 4 hours, climbing higher until the air was so thin Clara felt lightheaded. Then they crested a ridge, and she saw it. The cabin sat in a small alpine meadow, sheltered by a ring of towering spruce trees. It was a sturdy structure, built of heavy logs, with a stone chimney and a wide porch. It didn't look temporary. It looked like a fortress against the world. Silas rode to the front and dismounted. He helped her down, and this time, she was too tired to pull away. Her legs buckled, and he caught her, holding her upright for a moment. "We are here," he said. He led her inside. The main room was large and clean, with a massive stone fireplace, a table scrubbed white with sand, and shelves lined with tins and books. It was orderly. It was warm. He pointed to a door on the far wall. "That is your room," he said. Clara walked to the door and opened it. It was a small room, but it had a real bed with a quilt, a washstand with a pitcher, and a window that looked out over the valley. She turned to look at the doorframe. There was a sturdy iron latch on the inside. She looked back at Silas. He was watching her, his hat in his hands. "You can lock it from the inside," he said. "I won't come in unless the house is burning down." He walked to a cupboard and pulled out a bar of soap and a stack of blankets, setting them on the table. "There is water in the rain barrel out back. I will chop wood. You rest." He turned and walked out the front door, closing it softly behind him. Clara stood in the center of the room. The silence was absolute. There was no drunk laughter, no demanding voices, no threats, just the sound of the wind in the trees and the rhythmic thwack of an axe biting into wood outside. She walked into the small bedroom and closed the door. She slid the iron latch into place with a heavy clunk. She sat on the edge of the bed. She touched the quilt. It was clean. She thought of the money in her pocket. She thought of the latch on the door. She thought of the man who had ridden 4 hours in the snow without asking her for a single thing. The dam inside her broke. Clara buried her face in the pillow, wrapping her arms around her head. She did not cry because she was sad. She cried because the terror of the last month had finally been met by something stronger. She cried because, for the first time since her father died, she was safe, and the sheer relief of it was enough to shatter her. The mountains did not care about Clara Whitfield's past. They did not care about her debts, her grief, or the shame that still sat heavy in her stomach like cold lead. The mountains only cared about one thing. Could she keep the fire lit? And could she haul enough water before the sun dipped behind the granite peaks? The first week at the cabin was a blur of exhaustion and sharp, biting cold. Clara learned quickly that survival was a rhythm, a relentless drumbeat of chores that began before dawn and ended only when the tallow candle burned low. Silas did not treat her like a guest, nor did he treat her like a servant. He treated her like a pair of hands that needed to work to stay warm. Clara stood by the woodpile, the axe feeling heavy and awkward in her grip. She swung it down, the blade biting into the pine log with a dull thud. But the wood did not split. She wrenched it free, her breath pluming in the freezing air, and swung again. This time, the log cracked open, revealing the pale, fragrant grain inside. "Good," a deep voice said from the porch. Clara flinched. The reaction was instant and humiliating. Her shoulders hunched, her head ducked, and her grip on the axe handle tightened until her knuckles turned white. It was a reflex born of the last year, of avoiding her father's drunken stumbles and the sheriff's heavy hand. Silas stood on the porch, watching her. He saw the flinch. He always saw it. He didn't look away, but he didn't apologize for walking softly, either. He simply stepped down into the snow, moving with that uncanny quietness that made him seem more animal than man. "You are using your shoulders," he said, walking over to her. "Use your back. Let the weight of the axe head do the work." He didn't take the axe from her. He didn't step into her space to guide her hands, a move that would have made her skin crawl. Instead, he picked up a piece of kindling and mimed the motion. Standing 6 feet away, like a pendulum, he said, "Not a hammer." Clara watched him, then nodded. She adjusted her stance. She swung again, focusing on the arc, letting gravity pull the steel down. The log split cleanly in two with a satisfying crack. "Better," Silas said. He turned and went back to checking the lashings on the smokehouse door. He offered praise for the effort, never the obedience. He never told her to smile. He never told her she was pretty when she worked. He simply acknowledged the competence of her labor. But the nights were harder. The cabin was small, and though her room had a latch, the sounds of the house were intimate. Every time a floorboard creaked under Silas's weight, Clara would wake with a start, her heart hammering against her ribs. She would lie in the dark, counting the steps from her bed to the door, calculating how long it would take to get the knife from her boot. She hated it. She hated that fear had taken up residence in her body, rewriting her reflexes. She wanted to be the woman who had stood on the auction block with her chin high, not this trembling creature who jumped at the sound of a man putting a log on the fire. One evening, after a dinner of venison stew and cornbread, the silence stretched thin between them. The wind was howling outside, rattling the shutters, but the fire was steady. Silas sat in his leather chair, mending a bridle. Clara was darning a sock, the needle flashing in the firelight. "I do not know what I am doing here," Clara said. The words were quiet, but in the small room, they sounded like a shout. Silas stopped his work. He looked up, his dark eyes catching the flicker of the flames. "You are mending a sock," he said. Clara shook her head, frustration bubbling up. "No, I mean here, with you. You say I am free, but I am living in your house, eating your food, hiding from the town. Is that freedom? Or is it just a longer leash?" Silas set the bridle down on the floor. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He did not look angry. He looked thoughtful. "Freedom is not a lack of walls, Clara. It is the ability to open the door, He gestured to the heavy oak door of the cabin. "You can walk out that door any time you choose. You can take the horse. You can take the money I gave you. But you stay. That is a choice. And as long as you are choosing, you are free. Even if you are afraid." Clara looked at the door. It was true. The latch was not locked. The only thing keeping her here was the knowledge of what lay down the mountain. "I don't know who I am if I'm not fighting someone," she admitted, her voice trembling. Silas looked at her, and for a moment, the mask of the mountain man slipped, revealing a profound sadness. "Then rest," he said softly. "Fighting is heavy work. Put it down for a while." 2 days later, Silas announced they had to go to town. Clara froze over her coffee cup. "To town? We need flour," he said, packing a saddlebag. "And coffee, but mostly, we need to see the county clerk. That paper the banker signed is good, but it needs to be filed. We need a judge's stamp on a release form. If we don't, they can claim you ran off. We need to make the sale legally worthless." Clara felt the cold seep into her bones. The thought of riding back into Blackwood Ridge, of seeing those faces, made her stomach turn. "Do I have to go?" she asked. Silas stopped packing. He looked at her. "I can do it alone, but if you are there to sign it yourself, to look them in the eye, it leaves no room for their lies. It is better if they see you standing." Clara set her cup down. He was right. Justice did not happen in the dark. It happened on paper, in the light of day. "I will go," she said. The ride down was tense. The beauty of the snow-dusted pines was lost on Clara. She saw only the miles shrinking between her and the source of her nightmare. Silas rode close to her, his presence a solid wall against the wind, but he remained silent. When they entered Blackwood Ridge, the mood in the streets shifted. The town was just as muddy and gray as she remembered, but the eyes were sharper. As they rode past the general store, a woman sweeping the boardwalk stopped and stared. She didn't wave. She looked at Clara with a mixture of pity and judgment, as if Clara were something soiled that had been dragged back into the light. Clara kept her head up, staring straight ahead, but she felt the heat rising in her neck. "Look at that!" a voice called from the saloon porch. The mountain man brought his pet back for a walk. Laughter rippled through the group of miners lounging on the steps. Clara recognized one of them, a man who had bid $20 for her. Silas did not turn his head. He did not stop his horse, but Clara saw his hand tighten on the reins until the leather groaned. His jaw set hard, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He was a man who could snap a spine with his hands. Yet he rode on, refusing to give them the reaction they craved. Clara looked at him and saw something she hadn't expected. He wasn't just ignoring them. He was enduring them. He was used to this, used to being the outsider, the brute, the object of their ridicule. He was choosing dignity over violence, and he was doing it for her, so she wouldn't be standing in the middle of a street brawl. They dismounted at the county clerk's office. Silas tied the horses, moving with deliberate slowness. "Stay close," he murmured. They entered the office. It was a cramped, dusty room that smelled of stale tobacco and dry paper. The clerk, a weaselly man with ink-stained fingers, looked up and adjusted his spectacles. "Mr. Crow," the clerk said, his voice nervous. "And Miss Whitfield, we are here to file a release of indenture," Silas said, his voice filling the small room. He placed the paper on the counter. The clerk looked at it, then looked at the door as if hoping someone would come in to save him. I see. Well, the sheriff usually handles the filing of auction contracts." "The sheriff is not a clerk," Silas said. "You are. File it." The clerk swallowed hard. He opened a large ledger, flipping through the pages. Clara watched him. She saw him hesitate, his finger tracing a line. "There seems to be an issue with the original date," the clerk muttered. "The debt record shows the auction was retroactive." "Let me see," Clara said, stepping forward. She spun the ledger around before the clerk could stop her. Her father's name was there, but the numbers had been scratched out and rewritten. The date of the loan was listed as 3 months prior to when her father had actually taken ill. "They changed it," she whispered. They added interest for months that didn't exist. Silas leaned over the counter. His shadow fell over the clerk, dark and imposing. "Fix it," Silas said. "Or I will bring the federal marshal from Denver to audit every page in this book." The clerk went pale. "I can amend the record." "Clerical error. Just a clerical error." As the clerk scratched out a new form, the door opened. Sheriff Brady walked in, bringing the smell of cold air and arrogance with him. He stopped when he saw them, a wide, crocodile smile spreading across his face. "Well now, isn't this a cozy reunion?" Brady said. "How's the domestic life? Crow, she keeping your bed warm?" Clara felt the rage flare in her chest, hot and sudden. Silas shifted his weight, placing himself slightly in front of her. "We are finishing business. Brady, step aside." The sheriff chuckled. He leaned against the door frame, blocking their exit, just checking on county property. "You know, Thorne and I were just talking. That auction went so well. We're thinking of holding another one next month. Widow Miller's girl is turning 18, and her daddy owes the bank a fair bit. Shame to let good labor go to waste." Clara's blood ran cold. The Miller girl was a child, a sweet-faced girl who sang in the choir. "You wouldn't," Clara said, her voice shaking. Brady winked at her. "It's the law. Darlin', just business." Silas moved. He didn't draw a weapon, but he stepped forward with such intensity that the sheriff instinctively dropped his hand to his gun. "Move," Silas said. The word was low, vibrating with a threat that required no shouting. The sheriff looked at Silas's eyes, cold, dead, and utterly fearless, and his smile faltered. He stepped aside, mocking a bow. "Have a safe ride. Crow, watch out for wolves." Silas took Clara's arm and guided her out. They didn't stop until they were mounted and riding out of town, leaving the laughter and the mud behind them. Clara rode in silence, but her mind was racing. It wasn't just her. It was a system. They were going to do it again. The shame she had felt on the auction block began to curdle into something else, something sharper and more dangerous. It turned into anger. They reached the cabin well after dark. The silence of the mountains felt different now. It didn't feel empty. It felt clean. For the next few days, a quiet settled over them. It was a domestic quiet, born of shared routine. They cooked together in the evenings. Silas peeled potatoes with a knife big enough to skin a bear, his hands surprisingly delicate. Clara learned to bake biscuits in the Dutch oven. One night, Silas told a joke, a dry, wry comment about a squirrel that had been stealing their firewood, and Clara laughed. The sound surprised her. It sounded rusty, but genuine. Silas looked at her, the corner of his mouth twitching upward, and for a second, the air between them felt light. The shift happened on a Tuesday. They were hiking up the ridge to check the trap line. The snow had melted slightly in the afternoon sun, and then refrozen into a sheet of slick ice. The path was narrow, a ribbon of rock clinging to the side of the mountain with a steep drop into the ravine below. Clara was walking behind Silas, stepping where he stepped. Her boot found a patch of ice hidden under loose pine needles. She didn't even have time to scream. Her feet went out from under her, and she slid sideways, toward the edge. "Clara!" Silas spun around with impossible speed. He lunged, his hand shooting out and catching her wrist just as her boots went over the lip of the trail. He hauled her back, pulling her hard against his chest to keep them both from tumbling. They slammed into the rock wall on the safe side of the trail. Silas taking the brunt of the impact, he didn't let go. His arms were wrapped around her, iron hard and shaking. Clara was pressed against him, her face buried in the rough wool of his coat. She could feel his heart hammering against her own, a frantic, heavy rhythm. "Got you," he breathed into her hair. "I've got you." Clara looked up. His face was inches from hers. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown black with adrenaline. For the first time, she was acutely aware of the heat of him. He was massive, solid, and he smelled of snow and wood smoke and man. She didn't pull away. She felt a sudden, sharp pull in her belly, a rush of desire that terrified her more than the fall. They stood there for a long beat, the wind whistling around them, their breath mingling in the cold air. The contact was electric. It wasn't the grasp of an owner. It was the hold of a protector. Then, Silas blinked. He seemed to realize how close they were. He stepped back quickly, his hands lingering on her arms for just a second to ensure she was steady before dropping to his sides. "Watch your step," he said, his voice rougher than usual. "The ice is deceptive." I will," Clara stammered. They finished checking the traps in silence, but the air between them had changed. It was charged now. Every time he handed her a canteen, every time they brushed past each other in the cabin. Clara felt a jolt. She lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling. Desire felt dangerous. In the town, desire was a weapon men used against women. It was a debt to be paid. If she wanted him, did that make her weak? Did it mean she was just giving in to the man who bought her? But she remembered his hand catching her. She remembered the terror in his voice when she fell. He hadn't looked at her like property. He had looked at her like she was precious. Silas was struggling too. She could see it in the way he stayed outside longer chopping wood, the way he avoided her gaze across the dinner table. He was a man starving, but he refused to eat. He was terrified of being another man who took what he wanted just because he could. His restraint was fierce, a wall he built brick by brick every day. 2 nights later, the wind was howling again, a blizzard burying the cabin. The fire was the only light in the world. Clara sat on the rug by the hearth. Silas was in his chair. He had rolled up his sleeves to wash up, and, for the first time, Clara saw the scars on his forearms, thick, jagged lines that looked like burn marks or old cuts. "Silas?" she asked quietly. "How did you get those?" Silas looked down at his arms. He pulled his sleeves down quickly, buttoning the cuffs. "Old history." He said, "You know my history." Clara said, "You saw it on the auction block." Silas sighed. The sound was heavy, like a tree falling in the forest. He looked into the fire. "I had a wife," he said, 10 years ago, and a daughter. Her name was Sarah." Clara went still. He had never mentioned a family. "We lived down in the valley, near the creek." Silas continued, his voice monotone, detached. The fever came through. Scarlet fever. "It took Sarah first, then Mary. I nursed them for 3 weeks. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just watched them fade." He paused, his hands clenching into fists. "After they died, I fell sick, but I didn't die. I survived, and when I walked back into town, half dead. The preacher said it was a judgment. He said I must have sinned to be the only one left alive. The town, they needed someone to blame for the sickness. They chose me. They threw stones. They burned my barn." He looked at Clara, his eyes wet but unblinking. "That is why I came up here. I am not dangerous because I am wild. Clara, I am dangerous because I learned that people will punish you for surviving when they think you should have died." Clara's heart broke. She looked at this giant, scarred man and saw the depth of his loneliness. He believed he was cursed. He believed his survival was a sin. She moved. It was a small movement, sliding across the rug until she was sitting near his feet. She reached out and took his hand. It was huge, engulfing hers, the skin rough and calloused. She turned it over, tracing the lines of his palm with her thumb. It was not a sin to survive. "Silas?" she whispered. He went rigid. He stared at her hand touching his. He looked like he was afraid he might shatter her if he moved. "Clara," he warned, his voice a low rumble. "Be careful." "I am not afraid," she said. And she wasn't. Not of him. She looked up at him. His eyes searched hers, looking for fear, looking for obligation. He found neither. He found only a quiet, steady resolve. She squeezed his hand. It was an invitation. Silas leaned down slowly. The movement was agonizingly controlled. He brought his face close to hers, stopping an inch away. He let her bridge the gap. "Are you sure?" he asked, his breath warm against her lips. "Yes," she breathed. He kissed her. It was not the hungry, devouring kiss of a romance novel. It was slow. It was trembling. His lips were soft, hesitant, asking a question with every second. He did not grab her. He kept his hands on his own knees, as if he didn't trust himself to touch her yet. Clara closed her eyes and leaned into him. The kiss tasted of coffee and longing. It was a comfort. It was a healing thing. It broke something open inside her chest, a dam that had been holding back years of cold. When they pulled apart, they were both breathless. Silas looked at her with a wonder that made her throat tight. He reached out then, finally, and cupped her face in his large hand, his thumb brushing her cheekbone with a reverence that felt like prayer. For the first time in her life, Clara didn't count the distance to the door. She didn't want to leave. She was exactly where she chose to be. The peace of the high country was a fragile thing, easily shattered by a shadow. It happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Clara had arrived at the cabin. She was hanging laundry on the line strung between 2 lodgepole pines, the wet cotton stiffening instantly in the freezing air. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, the kind that made the eyes ache. She heard the crunch of snow before she saw him. It was not Silas. Silas moved like smoke, his boots finding silence even on crusted ice. This was a heavy, careless sound. Clara froze, her hands gripping a wet sheet. Her heart gave a singular, violent kick against her ribs. A physical memory of the auction block. The sensation of being hunted returned, cold and familiar, seizing her muscles. She looked toward the ridge. A rider sat atop a bay horse, silhouetted against the sun. He was too far away to see his face, but he was watching the cabin. He didn't wave. He didn't ride down. He just sat there, a dark statue of intent. Silas came out of the barn a moment later, carrying a bucket of feed. He didn't look up immediately, but he sensed the change in Clara's posture. He dropped the bucket and was at her side in 3 long strides, his body interposing itself between her and the ridge. "Go inside," he said. His voice was low, devoid of panic but heavy with command. Clara didn't argue. She abandoned the laundry and retreated into the cabin, sliding the heavy bolt home. She moved to the window, peering through the crack in the shutters. By the time she looked back, the rider was gone, vanished into the timber line as if he had never been there. But the feeling remained, a cold draft on the back of her neck that no fire could banish. That evening, the routine of the cabin changed. The domestic quiet was replaced by a grim industry. Silas did not sit by the fire to mend gear. Instead, he worked on the perimeter. He moved the wood pile to create a defensive berm near the porch. He strung tripwires with tin cans filled with pebbles along the narrow approaches to the clearing. The traps he usually set for wolves were brought closer, placed with lethal precision in the blind spots of the tree line. Clara watched him from the table. She felt small again, a parcel of goods that required guarding. The anger she had found in town began to simmer, fueled by the fear. She hated that a stranger on a ridge could turn her sanctuary into a fortress. "Come here," Silas said. He was standing by the gun rack. He took down a heavy Colt Peacemaker and a lever-action Winchester. He laid them on the table, the metal dull and oily in the lamplight. "I don't like guns," Clara said, her voice tight. "It does not matter what you like," Silas said gently. "It matters what you can do. If I am out checking the line, or if they come when I am sleeping, you cannot be helpless." He didn't say it to frighten her. He said it because he respected her enough to tell her the truth. The next morning, he took her behind the cabin to a clearing where a dead stump stood. He showed her how to load the revolver, his large hands moving over the mechanism with a grace that made the weapon look like a tool. "Not a killer. It is heavy," he warned. "Hold it with 2 hands. Do not close your eyes. If you close your eyes, you are just making noise. You must look at what you want to hit." Clara took the gun. It was cold and impossibly heavy. It smelled of sulfur and grease. She raised it, her arms trembling. "Breathe," Silas murmured, standing just behind her, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the heat of him. "Breathe out, then squeeze. Do not pull. Squeeze." She fired. The recoil shocked her, jarring her shoulders, the boom echoing off the granite cliffs like thunder. The bullet kicked up snow 5 feet to the left of the stump. "Again," Silas said. They spent an hour in the cold. Her hands ached, her ears rang, but by the end of the hour, she hit the stump. A splinter of wood flew off, and a strange, fierce satisfaction curled in her gut. It wasn't a love for violence. It was the realization that she could reach out and touch the world at a distance. She was not just a body to be grabbed, she was a force that could push back. That night, Clara took a leather-bound ledger from her trunk. It had been her father's, mostly blank save for a few pages of feed costs. She sat at the table, dipped a pen in ink, and began to write. She did not write a diary, she wrote a record. She wrote down the names of the men at the auction. She wrote down the amounts they bid. She wrote down the sheriff's words, verbatim. She wrote down the dates her father had visited the bank, and the sudden, suspicious change in the interest rates he had complained about before he died. "What are you doing?" Silas asked, watching her from the hearth. "I am making ammunition," she said, not looking up. "If they want to use paper to enslave me, I will use paper to hang them." Silas looked at her, and a slow, dark appreciation filled his eyes. 2 days later, supplies ran low again. They could not return to Blackwood Ridge. It was too dangerous now, so Silas decided they would ride to Cradle Rock, a smaller settlement, a half-day's ride to the east. It was little more than a trading post and a church, servicing the scattered homesteaders of the lower valley. The ride was tense. Silas kept his rifle across his saddle horn. When they arrived, the settlement felt tight, suspicious. News traveled fast in the high country, carried by circuit riders and gossip. Clara walked into the dry goods store, her head high. She wore her simple calico dress, her coat brushed clean. The storekeeper, a man named Henderson with a face like a dried apple, stopped wiping the counter when she approached. "We need flour, coffee, and 10 pounds of salt," Clara said clearly. Henderson looked past her to where Silas stood by the door, blocking the light. "I ain't got much stock," Henderson grunted, not meeting her eyes. "Prices are up, winter rates. I see the sacks of flour behind you. Mr. Henderson," Clara said. "What is the price?" $5 a sack, he said. "That is triple the price in Denver." Silas rumbled from the doorway. "Take it or leave it," Henderson said, looking nervously at his own hands. "We don't want trouble here. We heard about the arrangement." Clara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but she did not step back. She reached into her purse and slapped a gold coin onto the counter. The sound was like a gunshot. "The price of my flour has nothing to do with your gossip," Clara said, her voice icing over. "You will sell it to me, and you will give me a receipt. Or are you a thief as well as a gossip?" Henderson flinched. He took the coin, muttering, and began to weigh the goods. Outside, as they loaded the pack horse, a man in a black frock coat approached. He was the local preacher, a man with thin lips and eyes that judged everything they touched. He stopped 10 feet away, looking at Clara with a mixture of revulsion and pity. "The path of the transgressor is hard. Child," the preacher intoned, "you would do well to leave that man and seek penance. The church has a place for the wayward, provided they are silent and grateful." Clara tied the cinch on the pack horse. She turned slowly. The wind whipped a strand of hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. "Gratitude is for gifts. Reverend," she said, her voice carrying in the cold air. "I was not given anything. I was purchased. And silence is what allowed those men to sell me in the first place. I will not be silent, and I will not be grateful for scraps of mercy from men who watched me bleed." The preacher opened his mouth, then closed it. He had expected shame. He had not expected iron. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. Silas watched her. He didn't smile, but his eyes were fierce. "You fight good," he said softly. On the ride back, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind began to howl. A storm was coming, a true mountain blizzard that would bury the world for days. As they rode, Silas spoke, his voice raising over the wind. "The storekeeper, Henderson. He trades with the banker, Thorne. That is why the price was high. It is a squeeze." "Why?" Clara asked. "Why do they care so much?" I am just one woman. There are other debts. It is not just you, Silas said. It is the land. He pointed to the valley below them, a sweeping expanse of timber and frozen creek beds. Your father refused to sign over his water rights 2 weeks before he died. Silas said, I heard it at the saloon. Thorne wants to dam the creek to wash gold from the lower mines. He needs the water. Clara's mind raced. Her father had argued with Thorne. He had come home shaking with rage. And you? She asked. Why do they hate you? Because my claim, the one up near the timberline, sits on a vein of quartz that runs straight through the mountain, Silas said. Thorne has been trying to buy me out for 5 years. I won't sell. He thinks if he squeezes me, if he isolates me, I will starve out. He looked at her. Buying you, it gave them a lever. Now they can say I am a criminal. They can say I kidnapped you. They can use the law to come up the mountain and take the land. And you are the excuse. Clara felt a wave of nausea. It wasn't about passion. It wasn't even about the cruelty of men wanting women. It was about greed. Cold, hard greed. She had been sold not just for labor, but to be a pawn in a land war. They made it back to the cabin just as the snow began to fall in sheets of white. They stabled the horses, barred the door, and fed the fire. The storm hit with the force of a hammer, shaking the sturdy logs of the cabin. For 3 days, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the cabin, the fire, and the two of them. The air inside grew tight with heat and the unspoken things that lay between them. They moved around each other in the small space, a dance of avoidance and gravity. Clara would brush past him, and the contact would send a shock through her. Silas would hand her a plate, his fingers grazing hers, and he would pull back as if burned. The fear of the warrant, of the men down the mountain, made the safety of the cabin feel more intense. They were the only 2 people on earth. On the second night, the wind was a scream against the roof. They sat on the rug before the fire, the only light coming from the dancing flames. Clara looked at Silas. He was staring into the fire, his profile sharp and hard. He looked lonely. Not the solitude of a man who likes the quiet, but the loneliness of a man who has been exiled. Do you miss them? Clara asked softly. Your wife, your daughter. Silas didn't look away from the fire. Every day, he said, it does not go away. It just changes. It goes from a knife in the chest to a stone in the pocket. Heavy, but you can walk with it. I feel ashamed, Clara whispered. The confession bubbled up before she could stop it. I feel ashamed that I am still alive when my father is dead. I feel ashamed that I let them put me on that block. I feel like I am marked. Silas turned to her then. He shifted his body, facing her fully. You are not marked, he said. You are injured. There is a difference. A mark is what they put on cattle. An injury is what happens when you fight a wolf. You survived. Clara, shame is a trick. It is a way for them to keep owning you even after you are gone. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face. He didn't touch her, but the intent was there. Clara looked at his hand. She looked at his face, scarred by grief and weather. She saw the man who had bought her freedom and asked for nothing. The man who taught her to shoot. The man who made her tea when she had nightmares. She was tired of being afraid. She was tired of her body being a site of trauma. She wanted it to be hers again, and she wanted to share it with him. She reached out and took his hand, pressing it against her cheek. His palm was rough, warm, and solid. Silas, she said. He went still. His eyes searched hers, dark and intense. Clara, he warned, his voice rough. I am not a man who takes advantage. We are trapped here. You are vulnerable. I am not vulnerable right now, Clara said fiercely. I am choosing. Do you understand? I am choosing you. She leaned forward, closing the distance. She kissed him, and this time there was no hesitation. She put her hands on his shoulders, feeling the hard muscle beneath the wool shirt. Silas made a sound low in his throat, a sound of surrender. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into him. He was careful, so careful, as if she were made of glass, but the heat of him was overwhelming. Wait, he murmured against her mouth. Tell me to stop. If you want to stop, tell me, don't stop, she whispered. They moved together, the firelight painting their skin in gold and shadow. It was not a frantic grasping. It was a slow, deliberate reclaiming. Clara guided his hands, placing them where she wanted them. She took the lead, driving the pace, proving to herself and to him that she was not a passive thing. When they finally came together, it was fierce and tender all at once. It was a language of survival turning into something else, something like hope. Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not from pain. They were from the overwhelming shock of being held by a man who worshipped her pleasure rather than demanding her submission. Afterward, the fire had burned down to embers. They lay under the heavy buffalo robe, limbs tangled. Clara wept. She cried silently, her chest heaving. Silas held her. He didn't shush her. He didn't ask her why. He just stroked her hair with his large hand, his touch steady and grounding. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "Don't be," he rumbled, his chest vibrating against her back. "Let it out. It has been a long winter." The next morning, the storm broke. The sun rose on a world buried in white, blinding and pure. The silence was absolute. Then, the dogs barked. Silas was out of bed in a second, pulling on his trousers and grabbing the Winchester. Clara scrambled up, wrapping the quilt around herself, her heart hammering. 2 men were riding into the clearing. They wore heavy coats and badges that glinted in the sun. Deputies. Silas opened the door and stepped onto the porch. He was barefoot in the snow, shirtless, the rifle held loosely in one hand. He looked like a demon of the mountain, scarred, massive, and terrifying. "Far enough," Silas called out. The deputies pulled up their horses. They looked nervous. The stories of Silas Crow had grown in the telling, and seeing him half naked in the snow did not help their courage. "We have an order," one of the deputies shouted, a wiry man with a mustache that twitched. "County order to retrieve the woman, Clara Whitfield. She is a fugitive from a lawful contract." Silas didn't move. "She is not a fugitive. She is a free woman." "We have orders to take her by force if necessary," the deputy yelled, his hand drifting to his gun. Silas leveled the Winchester. The movement was a blur. One moment it was at his side, the next it was pointed at the deputy's chest. "You can try," Silas said, "but you will not ride back down." The tension stretched taut, a bowstring ready to snap. Violence was a breath away. Then Clara stepped out. She had dressed quickly in her dress and shawl. She walked past Silas, ignoring his attempt to block her with his arm. She stood at the edge of the porch, looking down at the men. "You say you have an order," she said. Her voice was steady, clearer than the deputy's. The deputy looked at her, surprised. "Yes, ma'am. From the sheriff. Show it to me." Clara said. The deputy blinked. "What?" "The warrant," Clara said, extending her hand. "If this is a legal matter, you have a writ signed by a judge. You have a warrant that specifies my name and the crime. Show it to me." The deputy shifted in his saddle. He looked at his partner. "Well, the sheriff said—" "The sheriff said is not a warrant," Clara interrupted, her voice whipping like a lash. "A verbal order from a crooked man does not give you the right to enter this property. Do you have the paper? Yes or no? We don't need—" the partner started. "Yes or no?" Clara shouted. The deputy's face flushed red. He looked at the rifle in Silas's hands, and then at the woman standing with the imperious fury of a queen. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he was in the wrong, and that everyone knew it. "We don't have it on us," the deputy muttered. "Then you are trespassing," Clara said. "Get off my land." The deputy glared at her. "This ain't over, girl. The sheriff will come back, and he will bring a posse, bring a judge," Clara shot back, "or don't come at all." The deputies turned their horses, spitting in the snow, and rode back toward the tree line. They retreated not because of the gun, but because she had stripped them of their excuse. She had made them feel like thugs instead of lawmen. Silas lowered the rifle. He looked at Clara. He saw the way she was shaking now that they were gone. the adrenaline draining away. He reached out and pulled her into his side. "They will be back," Silas said quietly. "I know," Clara said, leaning into his warmth. Silas looked down the mountain. "We cannot stay here. If we stay, they will surround us. They will burn us out." Clara nodded. She thought of the ledger in her trunk. She thought of the altered dates, the fake debts, the water rights. "We can't just hide," she said. "Hiding is waiting to die." "What do you want to do?" Silas asked. Clara looked up at him. Her eyes were hard, the green of the pine needles. "I want to destroy them," she said. "I want to take the evidence to someone who isn't owned by Thorn. I want to go to the district court. It is a long ride," Silas said. "Dangerous. We are already in danger." Clara said, "We might as well be dangerous back." Silas looked at her for a long moment. Then, a slow, grim smile touched his lips. "Pack your things," he said. "We ride at noon." The decision to leave the cabin was not made with fanfare. It was made in the quiet, grim silence of two people who realized that a fortress could easily become a tomb. If they stayed, the sheriff would return with enough men to burn the timberline down. If they wanted to live, truly live, they had to go to where the law was not owned by a single man. They aimed for Silver Creek, a mining hub 3 days' hard ride to the north. It was the county seat, large enough to house a circuit judge and, rumor had it, a federal marshal who passed through before the winter pass closed entirely. The journey began before dawn. The mountains were a wall of indigo against the lightning sky. Silas packed the horses with a ruthless efficiency, balancing weight against speed. Clara watched him, checking the cinch on her own saddle. She wore a pair of trousers Silas had cut down for her, hidden beneath her skirt for warmth. The pistol he had taught her to use sat heavy against her hip, a cold weight that felt less like a weapon and more like a third arm. "We ride hard," Silas said, his breath pluming in the air. "We do not stop for fire until nightfall." The first day was a lesson in the indifference of the wilderness. The trail was buried under fresh drifts, forcing the horses to chest through snow that reached their bellies. The wind was a physical blow, stripping the heat from their bodies the moment they stopped moving. By mid-afternoon, they reached the Snake River. It was swollen with early melt and choked with ice flows. The water was black and churning, tearing at the banks with a violence that made the ground tremble. "We have to cross," Silas yelled over the roar of the water. He went first, his massive roan gelding stepping gingerly into the current. Clara watched, her heart in her throat. As the water rose to Silas's stirrups, the horse stumbled once, slipping on the slick river stones, and for a terrifying second, Clara thought they would be swept away. But Silas held the beast steady, his thighs gripping the saddle, guiding the animal with voice and knee until they scrambled up the far bank. He turned and looked at her. He did not shout encouragement, he simply waited. Clara drove her heels into her mare. The cold of the water was a shock that stole her breath. The current grabbed the horse's legs, twisting the animal sideways. Panic flared, bright and hot. But Clara remembered the gun. She remembered the target practice. "Look at what you want to hit." She fixed her eyes on Silas. She did not look at the black water. She kept her eyes on the man on the bank. And she rode, when her horse lunged up the mud on the other side, shivering and wet. Silas reached out and caught the bridle. "Good," he said. "That was all. But in the howling wind, it was enough." They camped that night in a shallow cave. They dared a small fire, huddled together under the buffalo robes. They did not speak of love or the future. They ate dried beef and drank melted snow, their bodies aching too much for conversation. Survival was a jealous master. It left little room for sentiment. On the second day, the isolation of the high country began to thin. They encountered others on the road, travelers moving before the deep winter set in. They met a family of Swedish immigrants, a father, mother, and 3 children huddled around a broken wagon wheel. Silas stopped without a word, dismounting to help the man lift the axle. It took an hour of brutal labor to fix the wheel. The mother, a woman with a face worn smooth by worry, offered them bowls of potato soup. It was thin and watery, but it was hot. She spoke no English, but she touched Clara's hand and looked at the bruise fading on Clara's cheek, a remnant of a branch that had whipped her during the ride. The woman's eyes were kind, filled with a silent, weary solidarity. She knew what it was to be small in a big, hard land. Later that afternoon, they passed a homestead carved out of the rocky soil. A black man was chopping wood near the fence line. He was older, his hair white against his dark skin, his back bent but strong. Silas hailed him to ask about the pass ahead. The man, whose name was Moses, leaned on his axe and looked at them. He saw the way they rode. Silas watchful, Clara armed. "You folks running from something or to something?" Moses asked. "Both," Silas said. Moses nodded. He pointed north. "The pass is clear, but the sheriff in Silver Creek is a man who likes his fines. Watch yourself. The law down there has a way of twisting depending on who is holding the book. If you got gold, you are a citizen. If you got nothing, you are a vagrant. And they got a lot of room in the county jail for vagrants." Clara looked at Moses. She saw the caution in his stance. He was a free man, a landowner, yet he watched the road like a sentry. "Thank you," Clara said. Moses tipped his hat. "You watch that paper. Miss, in this country, a piece of paper can cut your throat faster than a knife." The final encounter was with a Mexican mule driver named Mateo, leading a string of pack animals loaded with mining gear. He shared his tobacco with Silas. When Silas mentioned they had come from Blackwood Ridge, Mateo spat on the ground. "Blackwood," Mateo hissed. "That is a snake pit. The banker there, Thorne, he tried to take my mules last spring. Said I owed a tax that did not exist. He thinks because he wears a suit. He is a king." Clara listened, sitting quietly on her horse. She had thought her pain was singular. She had thought her auction was a unique nightmare. But as she listened to the Swede, to Moses, to Mateo, she realized she was part of a vast, invisible web. The sheriff and the banker did not just hunt women. They hunted anyone who could not fight back. They hunted the poor, the foreign, the different. The realization did not make her feel smaller. It made her feel steel in her spine. She was not just fighting for her own freedom anymore. She was fighting a war that half the territory was already losing. Silver Creek was a shock to the senses. It was 3 times the size of Blackwood Ridge, a sprawling mess of tents, false front buildings, and brick structures. The noise was a constant roar, stamp mills crushing ore, teamsters shouting at oxen, the piano music from a dozen saloons. They did not hide. Silas rode down the main street with his head up, Clara beside him. People stared. A mountain man in buckskins and a woman with a revolver on her hip were a sight, even here. They stabled the horses and went straight to the newspaper office. The sign above the door read, "The Silver Creek Gazette." The editor, a man named Sterling, was covered in ink stains and smelled of gin. He was cynical, tired, and looked at them with suspicion until Clara placed her father's ledger on his desk. "This is proof of fraud," Clara said, her voice steady. "Altered dates, falsified interest. This is how the banker in Blackwood Ridge steals land, and this," she pointed to the release Silas had signed, "is proof that the sheriff sells labor contracts that are nothing more than slavery." Sterling looked at the ledger. He looked at Silas, who stood silently by the door, arms crossed. Then he looked at Clara. "If I print this," Sterling said, rubbing his jaw, "Thorne will sue me for libel, or send men to break my press. If you print this," Silas said, his voice low, "you will sell more papers than you have in 5 years." Sterling grinned. "That is true." They found a lawyer next. Tobias Finch was a small man with a hacking cough and an office buried under stacks of dusty legal tomes. He listened to Clara's story without interrupting. He read the ledger. He examined the auction receipt. "It is a clever trap," Finch said, taking off his spectacles. "They call it debt recovery. It gives them the veneer of legality. But with this ledger, and your testimony, we can prove coercion. If the debt was fraudulent, the auction was illegal. And if the auction was illegal, the sheriff committed a felony by holding it. I will pay your fee, Silas said, reaching for his money belt. Whatever it costs. Clara put a hand on Silas's arm. No. Silas looked at her, surprised. Clara turned to the lawyer. Mr. Crow is a witness. Clara said firmly, I am the client. I have $500 in gold. I will pay for this. Clara, Silas started. It is my life. Silas, she said, meeting his gaze. You bought my way out of the crowd. You cannot buy my voice. I will not be saved into silence again. I have to do this. Silas looked at her, and the protest died in his throat. He nodded, stepping back. As you wish, he said. They found lodging at a boarding house run by a Mrs. Gable, a severe woman with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. She ran a house for respectable women, but she had a reputation for sheltering those who had nowhere else to go. She looked at Clara's weary face and the shadow of fear in her eyes, and she gave them the best room at the back of the house, away from the street. The peace lasted exactly 12 hours. The next morning, the sheriff of Blackwood Ridge rode into Silver Creek. He did not come alone. He brought 4 deputies and a warrant signed by a corrupt circuit judge in his pocket. The confrontation happened in the town square, in front of the courthouse. Silas and Clara were walking to the lawyer's office when the sheriff's voice boomed out. There he is, the kidnapper. The street went quiet. People stopped their wagons. Shopkeepers came to their doors. Sheriff Brady swung down from his horse. He looked confident, his badge gleaming. He pointed a finger at Silas. Silas Crow! You are under arrest for the abduction of Clara Whitfield and the theft of county property. Silas did not move. He stood like a boulder in a stream, his hands hanging loose by his sides. She is standing right here. Brady, Silas said. Ask her if she is abducted. Brady laughed, playing to the gathering crowd. The poor girl is out of her mind. Folks, Stockholm Syndrome, that is what they call it. This savage dragged her up to his cave, abused her, turned her head. We are here to rescue her. The crowd murmured. They looked at Silas, large, scarred, frightening. It was an easy story to believe. Clara felt her knees begin to tremble. The eyes of the crowd felt like physical weights. The shame of the auction block came rushing back, a hot tide threatening to drown her. She wanted to hide behind Silas. She wanted to run. But then she remembered the stump in the clearing. She remembered the explosion of the wood when her bullet struck true. She remembered the ledger. She stepped away from Silas. She walked toward the sheriff. The crowd went silent. You are a liar. Sheriff Brady, Clara said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear. It cut through the murmurs like a bell. I am not abducted, she said, raising her chin. I was sold, by you, on a platform in front of the assay office. You took $400 from this man. You put the money in your pocket. She turned to the crowd. He calls it debt collection, but my father's debts were lies. I have the ledger. I have the proof that this man and banker Thorne altered the records to steal my family's land. And when I couldn't pay a debt that didn't exist, they sold me like a mule. The sheriff's face turned a mottled purple. She is hysterical, Brady shouted. Grab her. One of the deputies stepped forward. Silas moved. He didn't draw his gun. He simply stepped in front of Clara. Touch her, Silas said, and you will lose the hand. The deputy froze. I'm not hysterical, Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. I am angry, and I'm not the only one. How many of you have had your taxes raised by Thorne? How many of you have lost claims because the sheriff lost the paperwork? A murmur went through the crowd. This time, it wasn't fear of the savage. It was recognition. Clara pointed at the sheriff. You didn't come here to rescue me. Brady, you came here because I have the book. You came here because I know where the money went. The sheriff looked around. He saw the faces of the townspeople changing. He saw the newspaper editor, Sterling, scribbling furiously in a notebook. He saw that his power, which relied on silence and shame, was cracking under the weight of the truth spoken in daylight. We will settle this with the judge, Brady spat. He mounted his horse, signaling his men. Watch them. Don't let them leave town. He rode off, but the retreat was obvious. He had lost the first round. That night, the air in Silver Creek was electric. The story was out. Sterling had printed a special broadsheet by evening. Slavery in the high country, the sham auctions of Blackwood. Clara and Silas sat in their room at the boarding house. The adrenaline had faded, leaving Clara shaking. Silas sat on the edge of the bed, cleaning his gun. "You were brave," Silas said. "I was terrified." Clara whispered, "That is what brave means." He said, "They extinguished the lamp early, exhausted, but sleep was a shallow thing." Sometime after midnight, the door to their room burst open. There was no warning, just the crash of wood splintering and the rush of dark shapes. Clara screamed. A hand clamped over her mouth, tasting of leather and sweat. "Grab her! Get the book!" a voice hissed. It was not the sheriff's men. These were hired thugs, rough men paid by the banker to finish the job quietly. Silas roared. It was a sound of pure, primal fury. He launched himself from the bed, crashing into the intruders. The room was chaos, smashing furniture, grunts of pain, the dull thud of fists on flesh. Clara bit the hand over her mouth. The man yelped and pulled back. She didn't freeze. She didn't cower. She rolled off the bed, her hand scrambling on the nightstand until she found the heavy ceramic pitcher. The man lunged for her again. Clara swung the pitcher with both hands. It connected with the side of his head with a sickening crunch, shattering into pieces. The man dropped like a stone. Behind her, Silas had thrown one man through the window, the glass shattering into the street below. He had the other man by the throat, pinning him against the wall. "Who sent you?" Silas snarled, his thumbs pressing into the man's windpipe. "Thorne!" the man choked out. "Thorne sent us." Silas dropped him. "Get out. Tell him if he sends another, I will send him back in pieces." The man scrambled out the broken door, tripping over his fallen comrade, who was groaning on the floor. Silas slammed the door shut. Jamming a chair under the handle, he turned to Clara. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving. There was blood on his lip and a cut above his eye. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, rushing to her. Clara was standing by the washstand, clutching a shard of the pitcher. She was shaking violently, her teeth chattering. I hit him," she stammered. "I hit him." Silas took the shard from her hand gently. He tossed it aside and pulled her into his arms. "You did," he said, his voice rough with relief. "You did good." He led her to the bed. He lit the lamp, his hands trembling slightly. He saw a bruise forming on her arm where the man had grabbed her. Silas went to the basin, wet a cloth, and came back. He knelt before her. He wiped the blood from her lip, his blood, from where he had kissed her, or perhaps the attacker's. He cleaned the bruise on her arm with a tenderness that made Clara want to weep. "I wanted to kill them," Silas said softly, staring at the bruise. "When I saw his hands on you, the world went red. I wanted to snap his neck." "Why didn't you?" Clara asked. "Because then I would go to prison," Silas said, looking up at her. "And I cannot protect you from inside a cell. I chose you. I chose staying with you over killing him." Clara looked at him. The violence in him was terrifying. Yes, but it was leashed. It was controlled by his love for her. "I wanted to run," she admitted. "When the door opened, I just wanted to disappear, but then I thought about you fighting alone, and I couldn't do it." They looked at each other. The room was a wreck. The window was broken. The danger was closer than ever. But in that moment, the bond between them hardened into something unbreakable. Silas stood up. He pulled her to her feet and kissed her. It was a desperate kiss, tasting of fear and survival. They held on to each other with a grip that bruised, desire braided with relief. They were alive. They were together, and they were not done fighting. The next morning, the federal marshal, a man named Davies, came to the boarding house. He was a tall man with gray eyes and a reputation for being incorruptible. He looked at the broken door. He looked at the shattered window. "Mister, Sterling showed me the article," Marshal Davies said, tipping his hat to Clara. "And I heard about the disturbance last night." "It was an attempted murder," Silas said grimly. "It was an attempted kidnapping," Davies corrected. which puts it under my jurisdiction. He looked at Clara. I will read your ledger, Miss Whitfield. And if what you say is true, I will have a talk with Sheriff Brady. Does that mean we are safe? Clara asked. Davies sighed. He looked out the window at the busy street. It means I will open an investigation. It means there will be a hearing. But men like Thorne, they do not give up power easily. A cornered animal bites the hardest. He turned back to them. I suggest you stay in town. Don't go back to the mountain yet. I can keep an eye on you here. But watch your backs. The law is slow, but bullets are fast. Clara took Silas's hand. She felt the callus on his palm, the strength of his fingers interlaced with hers. We are not going anywhere, Clara said. We will wait for the hearing. The marshal nodded and left. Silas looked at Clara. His face was grim, but his eyes were warm. We are in a war now, he said. Clara looked at the bruises on his face. She touched the cut above his eye. We have been in a war since the day I was born. Silas, she said softly, at least now, we have a weapon. What weapon? He asked. The truth, she said, and each other. Silas kissed her palm. It was a promise. Whatever came next, the judge, the banker, the winter, they would face it standing side by side. The return to the valley was not a homecoming. It was an entry into enemy territory. The snow had begun to melt in the lower elevations, turning the roads into churning rivers of mud. But the atmosphere in Blackwood Ridge was colder than the high peaks. The first sign of the war appeared on a live oak tree at the fork of the road leading into town. A piece of parchment was nailed to the bark, flapping wetly in the wind. Silas pulled his horse up and tore it down. He handed it to Clara without a word. Wanted for kidnapping and theft of county property. Silas Crow, dead or alive. Clara stared at the block letters. The ink was smeared, but the malice was clear. It was signed by Sheriff Brady. He has made you an outlaw, Clara said, her voice tight. Silas took the paper back and crumpled it in his gloved fist. He has made me a target. There is a difference. An outlaw breaks the law. A target is just something a coward shoots at because he is afraid. They rode into the settlement of Silver Creek, where they had been staying while the legal gears turned. But the poison from Blackwood had seeped over the county line. When they entered the general store to buy ammunition and dried beans, the shopkeeper, a man who had taken their coin 2 days ago with a smile, now stood with his arms crossed over his chest. I cannot serve you. Mr. Crow, the shopkeeper said, looking at a point somewhere above Silas's left shoulder. Silas did not raise his voice. Is my gold not good here? The man shifted his weight. Sheriff Brady sent word. Said anyone aiding a fugitive is liable for aiding and abetting. I have a family. Silas, I cannot have the law coming down on me. Silas looked at the man for a long moment, his face impassive, then turned to leave. Clara did not move. She stared at the shopkeeper until he was forced to meet her gaze. The law? Clara asked quietly. Or the sheriff? Because they are not the same thing, sir. And one day, you will have to explain to your children which one you are afraid of. She turned and followed Silas out, leaving the shopkeeper staring at his boots. The social isolation was a heavy blanket. As they walked down the boardwalk toward the boarding house, Clara felt the eyes of the town upon her. It was a strange, suffocating mixture of judgment. The men looked at her with a leering curiosity, wondering what kind of woman rode with a savage. The women were worse. Some pulled their skirts back as she passed, as if her courage was a contagion that would ruin their reputation. But there were others, a washerwoman, scrubbing clothes in a basin behind the hotel, looked up as Clara passed. She checked to see if anyone was watching, then gave Clara a quick, sharp nod. It was a silent signal. I see you, keep going. Clara realized then that courage was a lonely thing before it was an admired thing. She was a symbol now, and symbols were rarely invited to dinner. We need more than the ledger. Silas said that night in their room. They sat in the dark to save candles, the streetlights outside casting long shadows across the floor. The lawyer, Finch, Says the altered dates are strong, but Brady will claim it was a clerical error. We need a witness who was inside the machine. I know who to ask." Silas continued. "There was a deputy, Miller. Brady fired him 6 months ago for refusing to beat a man who couldn't pay his taxes. He lives up near the coal seam. And I need to speak to Mrs. Gable again. Clara said she mentioned a girl, a young woman named Alara, who works in the scullery of the hotel. She came from Blackwood. I think she was sold too. They divided the labor." Silas rode out to find Miller, risking the open road where bounty hunters might be watching. Clara went to the church where Mrs. Gable ran her quiet charity. She found Alara in the back pew, a wisp of a girl with terrified eyes. It took Clara 2 hours of whispering, holding the girl's cold hands, to get the story. Alara had not been auctioned publicly. She had been traded in a back room to cover a gambling debt her brother owed the banker. "I cannot talk," Alara whispered, tears sliding down her nose. "They said they would put my brother in the dark cell, the one with no windows." Clara squeezed her hands. "If you do not speak, they will keep doing it. They will do it to your brother's daughter one day." Alara wept, but when she looked up, the terror had hardened into something brittle but sharp. "I will speak," she said. Silas returned 2 days later with Miller. The former deputy was a broken man, smelling of cheap whiskey, but he had a notebook. In it were the dates of the bribes banker Thorne had paid the sheriff to enforce the fake debts. "We have them," Silas said, his voice grim. But the banker, Thorne, was not a man to wait for the noose. He struck back not with bullets, but with ink. When Silas went to the assay office to draw funds for the lawyer, the clerk shook his head. "Your assets are frozen. Mr. Crow, there is a lien on your claim, a dispute filed by the Blackwood Mining Consortium. Until it is settled, your gold stays in the vault. They were trying to starve them out. They knew a legal battle cost money, and they were cutting the supply line. Then the weather turned against them. A late spring blizzard, fierce and unexpected, slammed into the valley. It howled through the pass, blocking the supply wagons and sealing the town in white. Food ran low in the boarding house. Mrs. Gable apologized as she served them thin broth and stale bread. "I can eat less," Silas said, pushing his bowl toward Clara. "No," Clara said. She pushed it back. "We share the hunger. Silas, you are not going to protect me from the reality of this. If we starve together. But we will not starve. We will win." The morning of the hearing, the snow had stopped, leaving the world bright and blinding. The makeshift courtroom in the town hall was packed. Every bench was filled. Miners, trappers, shopkeepers, and wives. They all came to see the show. Judge Holloway sat behind a high oak desk. He was a man of 60 with a face like a carved canyon wall. He was known to be harsh, but he was not known to be owned. Banker Thorne sat at the plaintiff's table, dressed in a suit of fine silk, looking bored. Sheriff Brady stood near the door, thumbs in his belt, glaring at anyone who looked him in the eye. Tobias Finch, their lawyer, looked small and frail next to the sleek attorney Thorne had hired from Denver. "Call your first witness," Judge Holloway boomed. "Clara Whitfield," Finch said. Clara stood. She wore her simple blue dress, washed and pressed. She walked to the stand, her boots clicking on the floorboards. She felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes. She saw the sheriff smirking. She saw Silas in the front row, his hands clenched on his knees, his face pale with the effort of not violence. She swore on the Bible. "Tell us, Miss Whitfield," Finch asked. "About the events of November 12th. Clara spoke. She did not shout. She did not cry. She told the story with a clinical precision. She described the cold wind. She described the sheriff's words. She described the feeling of the men's eyes as they bid on her labor. It was not a contract, she said, looking directly at the judge. It was a sale. I was told that if I did not agree, I would be thrown in the debtor's prison, and my father's grave would be dug up and moved to the pauper's field. A gasp went through the room. Thorne's lawyer stood up for cross-examination. He was a smooth man with a voice like oil. Miss Whitfield, he said, smiling. You claim you were coerced, yet when Mr. Crow paid your debt, you rode off with him, alone, into the mountains. Did you not? I did, Clara said. And you lived with him? In his cabin? Unchaperoned? I did. The lawyer paused, letting the implication hang in the air like smoke. Is it not true, Miss Whitfield, that you are actually Mr. Crow's paramour? That this entire story of an auction is just a way to extort money from the bank to fund your illicit lover's lifestyle? Clara felt the heat rise in her face. The room buzzed with whispers. Whore. Fallen woman. The words floated in the air. She looked at Silas. He looked ready to tear the bench apart. She took a breath. She looked at the lawyer. I went with him because he gave me the money and told me I was free. She said clearly. I went with him because he was the only man in that town who did not look at me like a piece of meat. She leaned forward. And you are asking about my virtue, sir, because you have no defense for your client's crimes. You attack my character because you cannot attack the facts. And that tells me you are losing. The lawyer froze. The judge hammered his gavel. Silence! Holloway roared. He looked at the lawyer. Move on, counselor. Or sit down. Silas took the stand next. He did not look like a victim. He looked like a force of nature stuffed into a Sunday shirt. Did you buy Clara Whitfield? Finch asked. I paid the sheriff $400, Silas said, to stop a crime. And what is your relationship to her now? Silas looked at Clara. For a moment, the courtroom vanished. She is my partner, Silas said. I do not own her. I do not command her. I stand beside her. And do you love her? Finch asked. The question was not legal, but Finch knew what he was doing. He was humanizing the beast. Silas paused. The silence stretched. I do, Silas said, his voice deep and resonating in the rafters. And because I love her, I would never take her freedom. That is the difference between me and the men at that table. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel until dust flew from the wood. Then came the evidence. Miller, the deputy, took the stand and read the dates of the bribes. Ilara, the girl from the hotel, wept as she told of the sheriff threatening her brother. But the final blow came from the ledger. Clara had found a loose page tucked into the binding of her father's book the night before. It was a letter, unfinished, addressed to the governor. Thorne has threatened to burn the barn if I do not sign the water rights. Her father had written, he says he has the sheriff in his pocket and can manufacture debts I do not owe. The judge read the paper. He looked at Thorne. Thorne was no longer looking bored. He was sweating. The hearing ended at dusk. The judge retired to consider the verdict. The next morning, the town of Silver Creek was buzzing. The editor, Sterling, had printed a special edition, The Web of Corruption Exposed. It named names. It detailed the bribes. Public pressure is a physical force. The marshal, Davies, who had been watching from the back of the courtroom, finally made his move. He arrested one of Thorne's hired thugs for an unrelated assault in a saloon. The thug, terrified of the federal charge, talked. He gave up the banker, but the sheriff was not a man to go quietly. While the judge deliberated, Silas and Clara received a message. It was from a neighbor near the cabin, a boy who had ridden hard to find them. They are burning it. The boy gasped. The sheriff. He is up at your place. He says he is seizing the property for the county. It was a trap. Silas knew it. Clara knew it. But everything they owned, everything they had built, was in that cabin. We have to go, Silas said. Marshal Davies is gathering a posse. Clara said, we should wait. If we wait, there will be nothing left, Silas said. And Brady will disappear into the high country. He is trying to draw me out. I am coming with you, Clara said. Silas checked his Winchester. I know. They rode out within the hour. The snow was deep, slowing their progress. By the time they reached the tree line below the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the snow. Smoke curled into the sky. The cabin was not burning yet, but a pile of brush was stacked against the porch. Silas dismounted. He signaled Clara to stay back. I will circle around, he whispered. Keep the horses quiet. No, Clara whispered back. She pulled the Colt peacemaker from her coat. "If you circle, he will see you against the snow. He expects you to be a hunter." "What are you doing?" Silas hissed. Clara moved toward a cluster of boulders that offered a vantage point of the porch. "I am being the distraction." Before Silas could stop her, she moved. She didn't run. She stalked, low and quiet, just as he had taught her. She reached the rocks and settled the heavy pistol on the granite. "Sheriff!" she screamed. Her voice echoed off the canyon walls. Movement on the porch. Sheriff Brady stepped out from behind a pillar, a rifle in his hands. He scanned the trees. "Come out, Clara," he shouted, "or I light the match. You're done." "Brady," Clara yelled. "The marshal is an hour behind us. Thorne has been arrested. There is nowhere to run." Brady laughed. A jagged, desperate sound. "I am the law in this valley." He raised his rifle, aiming not at her, but at the position where he thought Silas would be. He knew Silas would try to flank him. Silas broke cover, sprinting toward the woodpile for cover. Brady fired. The shot cracked through the cold air. Silas spun, his leg buckling. He went down hard in the snow, a bloom of red spreading on his thigh. "Silas!" Clara screamed. Brady jacked the lever of his rifle, grinning as he aimed at the fallen man. Clara didn't weigh the moral weight of violence. She saw the man she loved about to die. She looked at what she wanted to hit. She squeezed. The Colt roared. The bullet struck the wooden pillar inches from Brady's head, sending splinters flying into his face. He flinched, turning his aim toward her. Clara fired again. This shot hit the railing, throwing up a cloud of dust. Silas pushed himself up, dragging his wounded leg. He raised his Winchester. "Drop it! Brady!" Silas roared. Brady swung his rifle back toward Silas. Clara stood up from behind the rock. She exposed herself completely. "Look at me!" she screamed. "Look at the woman you sold." Brady hesitated. That split second of ego, of needing to silence her, cost him. He turned toward her. Silas fired. The bullet took Brady in the shoulder. The force of the heavy round spun him around and knocked him off the porch. He landed in the snow, groaning, his rifle flying out of reach. Clara ran. She ran across the clearing, the snow sucking at her boots. She reached Silas just as he collapsed back onto his elbows. "Silas!" She ripped her scarf off and pressed it against the wound in his thigh. The blood was dark and hot. "I'm all right," he gritted out, his face gray. "Just a flesh wound. Missed the bone." Clara's hands were shaking, but they were efficient. She tied the tourniquet tight. Brady was crawling toward his rifle. Clara stood up. She walked over to the sheriff. She kicked the rifle away, sending skittering across the ice. She leveled the Colt at his head. "Stay down," she commanded. Brady looked up at her. His eyes were wide with shock. He was bleeding, defeated, and looking up the barrel of a gun held by the woman he had treated like cattle. You won't shoot," he wheezed. "You're a girl." Clara cocked the hammer. The click was loud in the silence. "I am a free woman," she said, "and you are trespassing." The sound of hoofbeats thundered into the clearing. Marshal Davies burst through the trees. Leading 6 deputies, they swarmed the yard, guns drawn. "Lower the weapon." "Miss Whitfield," Davies shouted. "We have him." Clara stared at Brady for a long second. She wanted to end it. The rage was a fire in her blood, but then she heard Silas groan behind her. She slowly lowered the hammer. She stepped back. "He is yours." "Marshal," she said. The deputies hauled Brady up, handcuffing him. He screamed in pain, but no one listened. Clara dropped to her knees beside Silas. "Is it over?" Silas whispered, his eyes closing. Clara brushed the hair from his forehead. She kissed his temple, her tears finally falling hot and fast. "Yes," she sobbed. "It is over. Justice in the West was never perfect. It was a jagged, messy thing." Sheriff Brady was sentenced to 20 years in the territorial prison for corruption and attempted murder. Banker Thorne was caught trying to board a train to San Francisco with a suitcase full of stolen deeds. He lost his bank, his reputation, and his freedom. But not everyone faced the gavel. The men who had attended the auction, who had bid on Clara, largely went back to their lives. They suffered the shame of having their names printed in the paper. and their wives looked at them with new, cold eyes. But they were not jailed. The town of Blackwood Ridge had to live with the knowledge of what it had tolerated. It was a slow poison that would take years to clear. 3 weeks later, the snow had melted from the lower meadows. The cabin was repaired. The bullet hole in the porch pillar remained. A reminder. Silas sat on the porch, his leg propped up on a stool. He walked with a cane now, and he would likely limp for the rest of his life. Clara came out of the house carrying 2 mugs of coffee. She handed him one and sat on the railing, looking out over the valley. The green of spring was pushing through the mud. The marshal sent a letter. Clara said, "The release is official. The contract is voided. I am legally free." Silas nodded. He blew on his coffee. "You have the money," he said quietly. "The $500. And more now, from the settlement with the bank." "I do," she said. "You could go to Denver," Silas said. "You could open a dress shop. Or a school. You could find a husband who doesn't have a bounty on his head or a limp in his walk." Clara looked at him. She saw the fear behind his eyes. The fear that he was only a necessity, a shelter in a storm that had passed. She set her coffee down. She walked over to him and moved his leg gently to make room on the chair. She sat in his lap, wrapping her arms around his neck. Silas stiffened, then relaxed, his large hands coming up to rest on her waist. "I could go to Denver," she agreed. Silas looked away. "But," she continued, touching his beard, turning his face back to hers, "I do not want a dress shop, and I do not want a husband who doesn't understand the dark." She leaned her forehead against his. "You told me once that freedom is the ability to open the door." She whispered. "Yes," he rasped. "The door is open, Silas," she said, "and I am closing it, from the inside." She kissed him. It was not a kiss of gratitude. It was not a kiss of survival. It was a kiss of belonging. "I am not staying because you bought me," she said against his lips. "I am staying because I want you, because you are the only man who knows that I am not soft." Silas let out a breath he seemed to have been holding since November. He pulled her tighter, burying his face in her neck. "Then stay," he whispered. "I intend to," she said. Below them, the valley was waking up. The world was still hard. The mountains were still cruel. But inside the cabin, the fire was lit. And for the first time in a long time, the gun was hanging on the wall, cold and unused. They had fought the war, and they had won the only prize that mattered, the right to choose their own peace. The snow melted slowly that year, retreating up the slopes of the Blackwood Range like a defeated army. By June of 1879, the valley floor was a lush, vibrant green, fed by the swollen creeks that roared with meltwater. The town of Blackwood Ridge was still there, muddy and scarred, but the air in the streets had changed. The suffocating weight of the sheriff's reign was gone, replaced by a cautious, tentative reconstruction. Justice, Clara Whitfield learned, was not a sudden cleansing rain that washed away all the filth. It was more like the spring thaw, messy, slow, and revealing of what had been hidden beneath the ice. When Clara rode into town now, she did not lower her head. She sat tall in the saddle, wearing a riding skirt she had sewn herself. The silence that followed her was no longer filled with leering contempt or pity. It was a silence of reckoning. Men who had stood in the crowd at the auction now tipped their hats, their eyes sliding away in shame. Women who had pulled their children close when she passed now watched her with a guarded curiosity, and sometimes a quiet nod of respect. She was the woman who had brought the mountain down on the corrupt. And in the West, power, even the power of a woman, commanded deference. The final piece of her past arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a circuit clerk who looked far more honest than his predecessor. He rode up to the cabin, nervously eyeing the wolf traps, and handed Clara a thick envelope sealed with the territorial wax stamp. Clara sat on the porch steps to open it. Silas stood by the railing, whittling a new handle for the axe, but his hands were still. She unfolded the document. The paper was heavy, cream-colored, and smelled of official ink. It was a court order from the district judge in Denver. It declared the original debt auction of November 1878 null and void due to fraud, coercion, and illegal procedure. It stated, in clear, looping script, that Clara Whitfield was a free citizen with no outstanding financial obligations to the estate of Elias Whitfield or the Bank of Blackwood. She read it twice, then she read it a third time. Legally free. She whispered, on record, in ink, undeniable. She looked up at the mountains. She had known she was free in her heart for months, ever since she picked up the Colt Peacemaker, ever since she stood in the courtroom. But seeing it written down, stamped by the government, loosened a knot in her chest she hadn't realized was still tight. Silas folded his knife and put it in his pocket. He walked down the steps and stood before her. He looked at the paper, then at her face. "It is done, then," he said. "It is done," she agreed. Silas took a breath. He looked at the valley below, his expression unreadable. "You have the paper, Clara, and you have the settlement money in the tin box under the floorboards. It is over $600 now." He turned his gaze back to her. It was the same look he had given her on the day of the auction. Direct, honest, and painfully open. "The stagecoach runs 3 times a week now," he said quietly. "You can go to San Francisco. You can go to St. Louis. You can buy a house with windows that don't rattle in the wind. You can find a life that isn't hard labor and gun oil." Clara went still. She knew he would say this. It was his code. He could not fully accept her staying unless he opened the cage door wide and showed her the sky. He continued, his voice rougher now. "No guilt. Clara, you owe me nothing. You paid your way when you saved my life in the snow. If you want to go, I will saddle the mare and ride you down myself." Clara looked at the paper in her lap. She looked at the road that snaked down the canyon, the road to cities, to theaters, to soft beds and easy winters. She felt the old fear of being trapped, the instinct to run while the gate was open. But then she looked at the cabin. She saw the garden they had tilled together, the dark soil waiting for seeds. She saw the patch on the roof where Silas had replaced the shingles during the storm. She looked at Silas, the gray in his beard, the scar on his temple, the way his shoulders carried the weight of the sky so she wouldn't have to. She realized she was terrified. She was terrified of staying and terrified of leaving. But the terror of leaving was different. It was the terror of losing her home. She stood up. She folded the paper carefully and put it in her pocket. "I have never seen the ocean," she said. Silas flinched. Just slightly. "No," he said. "You haven't. I hear it is beautiful," she said. And loud. She stepped closer to him. "But I think I would miss the silence of the pines. And I would miss the man who taught me how to listen to them." Silas let out a breath, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. "Are you sure?" he asked, searching her face. "It is a hard life. Clara, I am a hard man to live with." Clara reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, calloused, and warm. "I am not looking for an easy life, Silas. I am looking for a true one. And I found it here." She squeezed his hand. "I am allowed to want freedom and love. Silas, I do not have to choose one. I choose both, and I choose you." Silas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, they were wet. He didn't say anything. He simply pulled her into his chest and held her, burying his face in her hair. He held her not like a prize he had won, but like a treasure he was terrified he didn't deserve. They rebuilt. The summer became a season of shared craft. Survival was no longer a lonely struggle against the elements. It was a partnership. They repaired the damage from the siege. Silas replaced the porch pillar that Clara had shot, but he left the wood unpainted, a reminder of the day she had saved him. Clara planted a garden on the south side of the cabin. She grew potatoes, carrots, and stubborn mountain beans. She worked the soil until her hands were as rough as Silas's, and she wore the dirt under her fingernails like a badge of honor. But Clara did not limit her work to the cabin. She found a purpose that extended beyond the tree line. She began to ride into town once a week, not for supplies, but for business. She met with Mrs. Gable, the churchwoman who had sheltered Alara. Together, they established a network, a quiet, underground railroad for women in the territory who were trapped in abusive contracts or sham marriages. Clara used her settlement money to fund it. She paid for stagecoach tickets. She paid for legal fees. She sat in the back of the church and listened to women who were bruised and silent. And she told them her story. She showed them that a woman could stand against a sheriff and win. She also began to write. She wrote letters to Mr. Sterling at the Gazette, detailed editorials that named the men who were trying to restart the old corrupt systems. She wrote with a sharp, clear voice, warning new settlers about the predatory lending practices of the mining companies. One evening, Silas sat by the fire reading one of her published letters. "We are told the West is a land of opportunity," he read aloud. "But opportunity without justice is merely predation. A town that sells its daughters to pay its debts is not a civilization. It is a graveyard." He lowered the paper and looked at her. She was sewing a quilt, the needle flashing in the light. "You write like you shoot," Silas said, a smile touching his lips. "Straight to the heart." Clara looked up. "Is it too much?" "No," Silas said. "It is exactly enough." Silas changed too. The darkness that had shrouded him for years began to lift. The nightmares that used to wake him screaming became less frequent, replaced by the quiet rhythm of breathing beside her. He laughed more, a deep, rusty sound that surprised them both. He stopped living like a man who was already dead, waiting for the winter to take him. He started planning for the next year, and the year after that, but the West was still the West, and it had a way of testing contentment. In late August, a man named Jeb rode up the trail. Jeb was a trapper, a man Silas had known for years. They had shared fires and whiskey. Silas trusted him enough to leave the gate unlatched when he saw him coming. Jeb rode into the yard, looking haggard. He claimed his horse had thrown a shoe and he needed tools. Silas, welcoming an old friend, turned his back to walk toward the barn. Clara was on the porch, shelling peas. She saw Jeb's hand drift to his belt. She saw the glint of metal that wasn't a horseshoe. "Silas!" she screamed. "Down!" Silas dropped instantly. The bullet whizzed over his head, burying itself in the barn door. Clara didn't hesitate. She snatched up the Winchester leaning against the wall and levered a round. "Drop it! Jeb!" she yelled. Jeb spun his horse, trying to aim again at Silas, who was rolling toward the cover of the water trough. Clara fired. She didn't shoot to kill. She shot the ground in front of the horse's hooves. The animal reared, throwing Jeb into the dirt. Silas was on him before he could hit the ground. He pinned Jeb to the dust, his knife at the man's throat. "Why?" Silas roared. Jeb was wheezing, his face caked in mud. $500. Jeb gasped. "The mining company. New management. They put a private bounty on you, said you were squatting on the claim." Silas went still. It was the betrayal that cut deepest. A man he had shared bread with, willing to kill him for $500. Silas looked at Jeb with cold eyes. He stood up and sheathed his knife. "Get up!" Silas said. Jeb scrambled up, looking terrified. "Get on your horse," Silas said, "and ride. If I see you in this valley again, I will not miss." Jeb mounted his horse and fled, disappearing down the trail in a cloud of dust. Clara walked down the steps, the rifle still in her hands. She stood beside Silas. They watched the dust settle. "It never really ends, does it?" Clara asked softly. "No," Silas said. "It doesn't. There will always be men who want what isn't theirs." He looked at her. "Are you afraid?" Clara looked at the rifle in her hands. She looked at the man beside her. "Yes," she said, "but I am not helpless, and I am not alone." They endured it. There were no grand speeches about victory. There was just the steady, practical work of survival. They checked the locks every night. They cleaned their rifles every Sunday. They vetted their neighbors carefully, earning trust slowly, inch by inch. They built a life not on the illusion of safety, but on the reality of preparedness. As autumn turned to winter, the air grew crisp and cold. The aspens turned to gold, lighting up the mountainsides like torches. One evening, just before the first snow, Silas asked Clara to walk with him to the high ridge behind the cabin. They stood on a granite shelf overlooking the entire valley. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and orange. The wind was biting, making their breath visible in white puffs. Silas turned to her. He took off his hat, holding it in his hands. He looked nervous, which was a rare thing for a man who had faced bears and posies. "We don't have a preacher," Silas said. "And I don't want to go down to the town for this." Clara felt her heart skip a beat. For what? Silas reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It wasn't gold. It was carved from a piece of polished ironwood, smooth and dark and strong. "I don't have words for poetry, Clara, but I want you to know. I want the mountains to hear it." He took her hand. "I promise you, Clara Whitfield, that I will never stand in front of your light. I promise that I will never confuse love with ownership. I promise to be the wall at your back, not the cage around you." He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "I choose you," he whispered. "Every day, until the mountain falls." Clara looked at the ring. It was simple and unbreakable. Tears stung her eyes, hot against the cold wind. She looked up at him. "I promise you, Silas Crow, that I will not run when the storm comes. I promise that my freedom is mine, and I am giving it to you, not as a debt, but as a gift. I promise to love you with my eyes open." She reached up and kissed him. It was a vow sealed in the cold air, witnessed only by the peaks and the wind. It was a private covenant, stronger than any paper signed in a church. That night, the intimacy between them changed. It was no longer shadowed by the past. Clara's desire was a language she spoke fluently now. She initiated, she guided, she demanded. And Silas met her with a reverence that bordered on worship. He did not devour her, he honored her. In the dark of the cabin, with the wind howling outside, they found a space where power was not taken, but shared. The winter passed. It was hard, as winters always were. But it was not lonely. Then came the spring. Clara woke early one morning in April. The cabin was quiet. Silas was still asleep, his arm thrown over his eyes. She slipped out of bed and dressed quietly. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The world was waking up. The snow was retreating again, leaving behind the heavy, wet scent of mud and pine needles. The creek was roaring. Green shoots were pushing through the earth in her garden. Clara wrapped her shawl tight around her shoulders. She looked out at the valley. She saw the smoke rising from chimneys in the distance. She saw the road winding away. She remembered the girl who had stood on the auction block, freezing and shamed. She remembered the terror of the ride up the mountain. She remembered the weight of the gun in her hand. She took a deep breath of the thin, cold air. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. She was standing on her own ground. She turned around. Through the open door, she could see Silas stirring. He sat up, looking for her. He saw her standing in the doorway, framed by the morning light. He didn't speak. He just waited. Clara smiled. It was a smile that reached her eyes, a smile of absolute, terrifying certainty. She stepped back inside. She closed the door, not to lock the world out, but to keep the warmth in. She returned to him by choice. She was free on paper, freer in her body, and strongest in the quiet. Simple fact that their love had survived the wilderness, the men and the past. She was home. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the high peaks and the dark valleys of the American West, exploring how love can grow even in the stoniest soil. I hope Clara and Silas's fight for justice and their quiet, hard-won peace resonated with you. I would love to know, where are you listening from today? Are you in the mountains, the city, or somewhere in between? Please leave a comment below and let me know. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of grit, romance, and survival from the frontier, please subscribe to From Wild West. And finally, I invite you to share your thoughts in English. What did you think of Clara's choice? Did the ending feel earned to you? I read every comment and cherish your insights. Until the next ride, stay safe on the trail.